Today is the 15th anniversary of one of the most horrific terror attacks in modern history. We're going to talk about it today with an expert in the field, my friend Tim Miller. That's coming up on today's Hot Zone.
This is the Hot Zone. Engaging with the news in a whole new way, international war correspondent Chuck Holton brings insight into areas of crisis and lets you help those affected.
Hey folks, thanks for being with us today. And I'm at my friend Tim Miller's house. He's been on the show many times before, and he's got a resume so long that it would take an entire show just to tell you all of his accomplishments. But we can just, for the purposes of this podcast, we can say that you served on the Joint Terrorism Task Force attached to the FBI.
Right.
And in that role, you studied the event that we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, that's correct.
And that is the terror attack and the siege at Beslan in Russia that happened 15 years ago. It actually, the siege ended 15 years ago today. And that's why I want to talk about it. It's got some very important lessons, I think, that we can learn from this attack. And it's good to remember these kinds of things, even though it's uncomfortable, because it is, as you said, something you wish you never had to learn about, correct?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, anytime you talk about targeting specifically children, I don't care who you are, it rises in you that's just evil. And this level of evil was something I hadn't seen to date in my career.
So let's just, for our viewers, go over kind of the basics about Beslan if they don't remember.
Right.
It happened at the first day of school in Beslan. That's a town in southern Russia. And the terrorists had been planning this attack for some time because they had actually gotten some of their operatives onto the construction team that was working on the school during the summer break. And so as members of that construction team, they were able to get in and pre-position weapons in and hide them inside the school. And then on the first day of school, which is a really big deal in Russia, it was not just the children at school, it was their parents, their families, their brothers and sisters. They were all dressed in their best to celebrate the first day of school. It's almost on the level of a national holiday. And so there were over 1,000 people at the school, something like 1,200 people. And these terrorists came rolling up in a truck, and that's when the attack began. They first shot the few policemen who were there, and then killed any other male who looked like he might be a threat. And then what happened was that they turned that school into a bunker of sorts, and a siege began that lasted 3 days until an absolutely horrific ending, which we'll get to in just a minute. But first, Tim, tell me what you remember when you were briefed on this. You know, what really stuck in your mind about this attack?
Yeah, I think, Chuck, the overwhelming thing that struck us in the law enforcement community was the pre-operational surveillance, that this was not something they just rolled out of vehicles and rolled into. They had been, in fact, studying exactly what went on at the school. They had done logistical planning. They knew exactly where they were going, which was to the gymnasium. They had rehearsed it, and when they executed it, it was flawless. Well, anytime you're not picking up on those pre-operational indicators, you're actually putting yourself in a huge disadvantage, because they knew what they were going to do. But you can see by the Russian response, they did not know what they were going to do in response.
Right.
It turned into quite a tragedy.
So within hours, the most elite Spetsnaz units in the Russian military were put on alert, but they were over 1,000 miles away in Moscow. And so they had to be put on a plane. By that night, they arrived in Beslan. And by that time, the terrorists had wired up the gymnasium with dead man switches.
Right.
They had tripwires going to the basketball hoops and wired around kids' necks so that if the kid fell over or fell off of that place, that it would detonate and kill all those children. Yeah. They had them all crowded in there. And then what happened?
Well, then they started systematic terror. I mean, the focus of the entire event was to demonstrate to the Russian government that they would not hold back in executing evil, specifically targeting children. Things that when I was briefed, honestly, I mean, I'd been a police officer, been a Marine, but I couldn't sleep that night. Specifically, going to a mom who has 2 small children, pick one that you want to see die, and executing that child in front of the mother and the other child. Systematic sexual abuse, raping mothers in front of their kids. They wanted it to be so horrific because their plan was to let some people survive so that they could tell the story. Now, the Chechens would say that their argument for doing that was the Russian treatment of their families in some of the zones. But this was an attack that was designed to establish a shock factor to the Russian people that they would never forget. And you know what? They accomplished that.
They did accomplish that, although maybe not in the way that they had hoped, because yes, the Russians had been fighting in Chechnya for some time, and these terrorists justified what they were doing by saying the Russians have killed our children in horrific ways by dropping bombs on them and that sort of thing. But at the same time, it wasn't the same, because the Russians were fighting a military conflict in Chechnya, and they were going after military hard targets. The terrorists were going after soft targets filled with innocents. And that, you know, in the case of Russians killing Chechnyan children, it was very rare, at least in my understanding, that Russians were actually targeting Chechnyan children. They were targeting the terrorists, but the terrorists, as they have throughout history, were using soft targets to hide in. They were using hospitals and mosques and schools and things like that to fight from. You know, if you put a sniper in the window of a 3rd grade class, and the Russians take the sniper out with a tank round, and children in that class die. It's not, I think that from an ethical standpoint, you can't judge the Russian army for doing what they had to do against that military target. When that sniper chose to use a mosque or a school or a hospital as his place to attack from, he made that a military target. Would you say that?
I totally agree. But I think in the depraved thinking of an extremist, the response was overwhelmingly excessive.
Of course.
And hello, America, there's a wake-up call here. There's a very clear understanding by extremists that children are going to grab the attention and the heart of a nation. And so I think one of the takeaways, you know, as we're seeing, unfortunately, in America, our kids being targeted and slaughtered oftentimes by other kids.
Yeah.
It's sick.
It is.
But it does remind us that soft targets like children are going to get the attention that terrorists seek. And so it's not without beyond the pale to think that they're going to continue this type of thing.
Right.
And quite honestly, that was one thing in the U.S. law enforcement community that was a wake up.
I think that you could look at this and you could say, okay, so here are some Muslim extremists that are taking the fight to the Russians in the most despicable way possible by targeting children who have nothing to do with the conflict. And in the same way, we have created a lot of enemies over the last 18 years.
Right.
In the global war on terror, because we've been bombing the heck out of Afghanistan, Iraq, and other places, Yemen, around the world. And so there are extremists out there that will seek to hurt America by carrying out despicable acts in any way they can on American soil if they're able to pull it off. But I think it's important to point out, Tim, that they don't hate us because we were bombing them. They hated us before we bombed them.
That's right.
And they don't pull these kinds of stunts because they hate our policies.
Right.
They pull these kind of stunts because they hate.
That's right.
Period.
That's right.
And we have to point out that Muslim extremists kill far more Muslims than they do Americans or Christians or anything like that.
Yeah.
And so to try to draw the logical conclusion that, oh, if we just be nice to these people, or if we just leave them alone, they'll stop killing us, is a absolute false response.
That's
because
right.
they're not going to stop killing us. They hate. They kill because they hate. And they're not going to stop hating because we stop killing them back. Okay, and we didn't start this, first of all. So I think that's important to point out. Now, we talk about takeaways. Tell me about what happened as the siege wore on and there at the end. What happened?
Well, unfortunately, it got worse and worse. You've heard the term 3 days of hell. I think that's an understatement in this case.
Yeah.
They wouldn't let little kids drink water. They wouldn't let them go to the bathrooms. You can imagine being in a place crammed in where no one can go to the bathroom. Children are suffering. They're being abused and mistreated and periodically killed. So the shock factor, the fear factor, the physical conditions, it's way more than any normal human being can see, especially a child.
I read about one 6-year-old boy that begged one of the teachers to urinate in a bottle so that he could drink it because he was so thirsty. Yeah. And as you said, they were being systematically sexually abused. I have footage of the end of the siege as we'll get to that here in a second, what happened. But what you'll see is that all of these children are running out of that building naked. And they're naked because they have they were intentionally stripped naked in that gymnasium in there. And again, many of them horribly abused and just had their childhood ripped away from them.
Right.
Very hard to see. And I warn you that this footage is graphic, that you'll see of people being carried out and running away from that building. Now, some kids were able to escape.
Right. Very few, though.
Right. And then in my understanding, one of the explosive devices that they had rigged, because they had the whole building rigged to explode, one of the explosive devices had an accidental discharge, went off somehow, we don't know how. And when that explosion went off, there was something happening outside at that very moment. And that is that there was a group of fathers of these children who had gone home and gotten their firearms, their own personal firearms. I was told in this part of Russia that not every person has a vehicle, but every person has a firearm. And these fathers had gone home and gotten their firearms, and they had come to that site and they had said, this has gone on for 48 hours. We can hear our children screaming and crying and dying in there, and we are going in to get them if you won't. And the police were doing everything they could to try to keep these fathers back. Well, when this explosion went off, accidental discharge, they heard that explosion happen in there. And then it was all over but the crying at that point. The fathers and the Spetsnaz unit who was there on duty rushed the building, and without much of a plan, without any plan really. And it created absolute mass chaos and carnage. And you can hear the firefight going on. And I'm going to stop right here and I want to play some of the footage from that moment. Listen to this. Okay, so you can hear the guns going off. You can hear people screaming and running. You can see here on the footage where people are being carried out of the building, wounded and fainting, and just absolute chaos. In that melee, 10 Spetsnaz troops were killed, and some of them, I'm told, were killed by terrorist snipers as they shielded these children with their bodies, because the terrorists were doing everything they could to kill as many of these children as possible. And in the end, what was the upshot?
Well, I mean, I think the good news, if there is one, is that it was over. You know, the bad news was 300 and whatever people died. I was shocked to see that of the 11 or 1,200 in the gymnasium, over 1,000 were killed or wounded.
So 300 and something were killed and over 700 were wounded.
That's correct.
So almost everybody that came out of that gym was either killed or wounded.
Well, and everyone will never be the same again.
Of course.
The emotional damage is the thing that sticks with me. They periodically do some reporting on the survivors, 10 years, 15 years.
Right.
It's ugly.
So what was the impact on Russia and on the Russian government when that was all over?
Well, I think the Russian government's not the U.S. government. There was serious retribution, and they systematically, their intelligence organizations went in and dealt en masse with the leadership of the extremists, the Chechens, and
their families.
Yeah. And ultimately, we saw a decrease, in those types of attacks in nature. Because again, remember that the goal of the terrorists was to up the ante. Well, they did.
Right. Well, and they had actually given some demands, and some of the demands were reasonable, if you can call it that, in that they wanted these prisoners released or those prisoners released or whatever. But one of their demands was that Russia leave Chechnya altogether, and that's just not something that could happen in a day or two. And the terrorists knew that demand was one that Russia could never accept.
Right.
And so they fully intended for all of those kids to die and all of the terrorists to die. Right. And so the fact that any of them survived is really kind of a miracle, especially with all the prior planning that the terrorists had, and the time that they had to get prepared.
Right.
Now, like you say, Russia hunted down and murdered all of those terrorists and the families of the terrorists. One of the main terrorist who had planned that, and I'm not even going to utter his name, partially because I couldn't pronounce it and partially because I don't want to give him the publicity. I don't think that we should ever give out the names of these cowards. Whether it's a church shooting, a school shooting, or anything, we should never utter the name of these horrible, horrible people ever again. They should be blotted out from memory, and maybe that will go a long way to stopping these kinds of terror attacks that we see in the United States. But nevertheless, that guy was the same guy who had planned an attack on a theater earlier, several years earlier, that had killed over 300 people. I think it was 300 people. And then there was a hospital attack as well that he was responsible for. So taking him off the planet was a very good thing that the Russians did a favor to everybody by getting rid of him. And they took a very hard line, as you said, on that. Now, let's fast forward to today, 15 years later. We see in America all these mass shootings. We see the just ridiculous number of whether they're attempted terror attacks or accomplished terror attacks, both in the United States and outside the U.S. Many of them aimed at Christians, all of them aimed almost at soft targets.
Correct.
So you work in the security field,
right?
Advising companies and businesses and churches on how to secure their facilities. What is your advice for people looking back at Beslan in the light of that event and in the events that have happened subsequent to that?
Well, I think the biggest thing in today's culture is we have to own our own security. It is time for Americans to pay attention to what's going on around you. I flash back just a short time ago to the highway shooter in Texas. Here's a man who everybody said after the fact, well, he's been on the edge. Well, that's good. It's good that people recognize that. It's real bad that proactive steps weren't taken. And Beslan's another example. If people noticed unusual activity, if they were able to contact the police in advance, if they were able to take note of specific things, don't just look at people and say, oh, that looks unusual. Get specific information. Get license plates. Own your own security, because it is happening at an increased frequency. But the good news in all that is that you can make a difference. You can be a person who, we talk about this all the time when I train tactical teams. It's all about being proactive. Security is all about making it not happen, not waiting for it to happen and trying to clean the mess up.
Right.
So I'd say
I think we focus way too often on the what do I do if an attack takes place at my church or my school, but we should spend a lot more time thinking about how do we keep it from happening in the first place.
That's exactly right.
And I think that is where there's actually a lot of overlap. I mean, look, there are two sides to this debate in the United States. There's the debate there's the side that says, well, I'm going to, get my concealed carry permit and I'm going to carry it everywhere so that I can be prepared to do something about it if something like this happens where I am. The other side says we need to make sure that nobody has any of these deadly weapons so that this will stop happening. I think that anybody who knows us knows which side of that we fall on, but
right.
the thing you have to remember is that you cannot make people safer by trying to make them more vulnerable. That making everyone more vulnerable does not make people safer, and it's proven by the fact that every one of these attacks takes place. They don't take place in police stations. They don't take place at gun ranges. They don't take place in the military barracks. They take place in schools and churches and places that are perceived to be soft targets. And so we need to harden our targets, but we also need to harden our thinking. And that's what you're talking about.
Yeah, and I think too that, I've had this conversation. It's not about a gun, it's about a lifestyle. I've been a firearms trainer for 25 plus years. And I will tell you that I've seen law enforcement guys that scare me with a gun in their hand. Why? Because they're not committed to train with that weapon. Mm-hmm. And here's what I would say to everybody out there. The answer is not you getting a CCW and you going down and you're going to be the hero of the day. That's kind of like asking a 16-year-old that just got their learner's permit to jump on the Indy 500 and be able to deal with it. It doesn't work like that.
Right.
Being a committed warrior means that you're willing to train mentally, physically, and with that weapon on an ongoing basis. Now, I do believe that's the answer. Right. There's just not enough police to go around. And people will tell you that have been in active shooter situations. I've talked to them that that's the longest 3 or 4 or 5 minutes of their life waiting for that police officer to show up. And so it's important that we recognize that keeping our family safe rests with us. Well, keeping our churches safe rests with us.
Absolutely. And if you want to know more about that, developing that kind of bulletproof mindset, that sort of combat mindset, that doesn't mean that every housewife has got to be a hardened, combat warrior. What that means is that we have to develop a set of expectations and understandings and a way of perceiving the world that is just open to finding these things that are something's wrong. That's caring about each other enough to say, man, I know you've been going through some hard times and I've seen some of your posts on Facebook and they're kind of concerning me. Can we talk about this? That sort of thing, instead of just trying to do the polite thing and sort of ignore anything that makes us uncomfortable. And so that's also the same when you're at church and you see the guy come in who looks disturbed or looks upset or who looks angry. Is right. Not just going, oh boy, I don't want to talk to that guy. It's no, you go up to him and you say, hey, can I help you get with something? Can I get something for you? Would you like a cup of coffee? Can we talk? Right. And when people know you care, we can make a difference. So if you'd like to know more about that, lhisg.com, that's Lionheart International Services Group. That's the company Tim is a part of. I'm also involved with that and glad to be. And so you can find more about it at that website. And tell us more, just real quick, about your business and about what you're
offering. So we literally are a team of security professionals. Most guys come from either the feds, FBI, Secret Service, or tactical law enforcement at the local level. We do have some military guys, special guys. But our focus is, we've been there, done that. We've kind of done a lot of what we dreamed of doing, and now we just want to help people. It really does start, Chuck talked about this, starts with a plan, but it's got to be a good plan. It's got to be a plan that you actually know and can do. And I help corporations, businesses, churches just kind of figure that out. People forget that a comprehensive plan is not just about having a gun in your glove box. A comprehensive plan is thinking about physical security measures. It's about protecting your data, your information, your leadership. All those things matter, and when they come together, then you're creating a safe place. And that's where we want to be.
All right. Well, thanks.
Thank you.
Appreciate
brother.
it.
Good seeing you.
All right. That's all we've got for the Hot Zone today. Thanks for being a part of it. I am headed to the Bahamas as you watch this, most likely. And so we're going to have some more reports for you from that absolutely devastated community coming up on the Hot Zone. So stay tuned.
The Hot Zone is produced by Amy Holton and Livefire Media. Copyright 2019.